You've seen it in the headlines. Across the country, employees are facing serious consequences or even losing their jobs for expressing political views in and out of the workplace. However, this isn't a new issue. Navigating politically charged situations has always been a tough challenge for HR professionals. Welcome to Honest HR, where we turn the real issues facing today's HR departments into honest conversations with actionable insights. I'm your host, Nicole Belyna. Let's get honest. While free speech is a First Amendment right, it doesn't always protect employees from consequences at work. Today, we'll cover the legal landscape, including what HR needs to know about employees' rights when it comes to political activity, policy and culture, how HR teams can craft fair policies, maintain respect in the workplace, and handle politically charged situations effectively. And finally, hypothetical scenarios where we'll translate legal jargon into practical guidance and offer solutions for how HR should respond. Joining us is Tom Spiggle, founder and attorney of Spiggle Law Firm. Welcome to Honest HR, Tom.
Thanks for having me. We're excited for this.
Let's get right into what everyone wants to know. Can political speech, nonverbal expression, activities, or even political affiliation itself be a legitimate reason for termination?
Well, I'm going to give my lawyer answer and say it depends. In many, I think a lot of people are surprised by this. In many instances, yes, it can be. But as folks who do employment law know, there are a lot of state and local exceptions and also exceptions if you work for a federal or state government.
So does it matter where the activity takes place? For example, in the workplace versus activity outside of work?
Generally, no. Assuming you're in a state that doesn't have a cause of action for political activity or out of work activities, and there are, about a half dozen that do have those restrictions. But you're assuming you're not in one of those states, then it doesn't matter if it's in off duty or on duty. Their employers are usually on the stronger ground if it's, the speech is happening in the workplace, but that doesn't mean that they can't take action if the speech takes place outside of the workplace.
Okay. And what about working in the private sector versus the public sector? How does that impact employee rights?
Yeah, great question. So, as is often the case, private sector folks have a lot fewer protections than workers in the public sector because in the private sector, you don't have any First Amendment rights. You have First Amendment rights, but they only protect you against government action. But if you work for the government, then you have First Amendment rights. Now, they're not the same as the kind of rights you would have for, let's say, holding a political rally on a sidewalk, but you do have First Amendment protections. The federal government still has the right to control its workplace, so it's not absolute, particularly if it's causing damage or disruption in the workplace. But federal workers do have some protections for speech, both in and outside of the workplace. Many state workers do as well. It really sort of depends on, in many instances, on the state constitution.
Well, you just alluded to my next question. What about the Constitution? That's something that employees bring up a lot. They'll just say the Constitution. What about it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because we all learn in grade school about, the First Amendment and First Amendment protections, which is, of course, a key component to our democracy. And a lot of people understandably get confused about that. So, yes, we all have First Amendment protections for most kinds of speech, but that's not true in the private workspace because, again, the Constitution protects you from government actions, not from actions by a private employer. So a private employer has wide authority to discipline, up to firing you. Again, if you're not one of these half dozen states that has these laws in the books that prevent it. If you're not in one of those states, then your First Amendment, it's not government action by a private employer. So it doesn't protect you in your job.
So beyond the First Amendment, are there any federal laws in place that protect political activity or expression?
Yeah, this is a sticky one. There's not any overarching federal law that protects workplace speech. There is the National Labor Relations Act, which protects what we call concerted speech. So if you are talking about, workplace conditions, you're talking about pay, you are, conducting union activities, anything where you are acting collectively in the workspace to try to improve or address workplace conditions, then you are protected. And that can overlap with political speech. So if you are taking a political stance that also has implications for workplace safety or workplace pay, then that can be protected under the National Labor Relations Act. So there is that federal law, but it has to be concerted activity, and that can include online activity, that can include out of work activity. So it is a pretty broad spectrum. Depending which administration is in office, the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, can take a very broad or a more restrictive view of what would constitute concerted activity. So there's that law, but outside of that one, there's no federal law that specifically deals with political speech in the workspace.
So some states have laws in place to protect employees from discrimination based on politics. Can you break down for us what some of these limited protections mean and perhaps what they don't?
Yeah, sure. So, and again, it can vary by state. There are about a half dozen of them. We've got kind of the usual suspects. California and New York and Washington, D.C. Do have local laws that broadly protect out-of-work speech. There are some states like Colorado or in North Dakota that have laws that protect any kind of lawful off-duty activity. So that which could include political speech or attending political rallies. I think the key is it has to be lawful. And so, if you go to a rally and as we've increasingly seen, there's property damage and you're participating in that, then you would not be protected from those kinds of activities. But if you're in New York, California, Colorado, Washington, D.C., I think Louisiana is another one. And if you're going to a political rally, even, off duty, you're expressing your political beliefs in a lawful way, then you would be protected from that, and you could have an action. You could bring a lawsuit if you're fired for that political activity.
How should HR handle social media content by employees that are politically charged? We see this so much more frequently today. People are very comfortable sharing their political views, right?
Yeah. It's a difficult needle I appreciate for HR to thread because I don't think most companies don't want to, right? They just don't want to mess with that, right? They want to conduct their business. They want to have good employees. They want to reward good employees. And so I don't think folks are rushing out with some limited exceptions to try to control what's happening off work or on social media. But as you mentioned, these are different times, and we have seen where out of work or social media activity, online activity can really affect the workplace. So I think for HR, as always, having a policy going into it, right? Having a well thought out, and I know SHRM has some great resources on this, a good social media policy about what is and what is not acceptable. I think anytime that there is a connection to something going on in the workplace, some disruption, some negative impact that this online speech is having on the company, making a record of that. If you're getting complaints from customers, from vendors, if you're getting other employees who are being upset with that speech, I think is key, because for human resources, what you're trying to do is show that you are addressing conduct, not speech. So it doesn't matter on which side of the aisle that the speech is happening. If it's having a material impact on the business, then the company's on pretty solid ground if it needs to take action. So making sure that that's demonstrated. If you're getting those complaints, if you're getting those calls, keep a record of that. To be able to show, if it comes to it, that the reason that the company took whatever action it decides to take, it was because of real impact on the workplace, not because of whatever political views the employee is expressing.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really good point. So it's not just what they say, but how they say it and how they're conducting the dialogue. I'm always kind of blown away more and more frequently. public posts that people will share on social media, particularly, on a place like LinkedIn, which is supposed to be a professional networking site. People look for jobs there, they build their network, they may be looking for opportunities for another job, to join a nonprofit board. And there's a lot of inflammatory communication. And, these people have their employers' names right on their profiles. Interesting, they may not get, perhaps they can remain employed with their organization, but it does make me wonder, from a job seeker perspective, people can see that. I mean, once they put it out there, it's out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly LinkedIn, right? I mean, as you say, that's tends to be, people that express political opinions usually do it elsewhere, but we've seen more and more of it on LinkedIn. But, as you know, it's not hard to find people's social media profiles. So, even if they are, conduct this on Facebook or TikTok, whatever the platform may be, we've seen it recently where this can have a real impact on the company because people will, like you said, it's not hard to find out where people work generally, and then to start contacting that company, to make complaints, whatever, or cause trouble for that, for that employee. So, but you're right, on LinkedIn, the employee is really playing with fire because it's right there, it's sort of branded. And I think for HR, I mean, that's a stronger connection. You can say, hey, and, of course, and I think the audience certainly knows this. It doesn't have to be termination, right? You can call people in and, have a discussion with them about, remind them what the social media policy is, and tell them, like, look, this is what's happening to the company as a result of your speech. We're happy for you to have your opinions, but this is the real world impact that we're seeing. We're getting these calls, we're getting these complaints about what you were saying.
Yeah. Well, and, our scenario here is an employee outside of HR, and HR doing the monitoring, if need be, or, kind of evaluating that conduct. But certainly, on LinkedIn and other social media platforms, it could be your HR person making those comments.
Sure.
And, it almost presents an even more difficult challenge, particularly, when they're the one as part of that evaluation for others.
Yes. It's become an added layer of complication, sure.
It is. I want to present to you a hypothetical scenario. An employee posts an extreme political content on social media outside of work hours, and the post gets sent to HR. So your company isn't listed, it's not mentioned on the employee's social media profile, and they do have a note on their profile that says, "Views expressed are my own and do not reflect the views of my employer." What does HR do? And does that disclaimer mean anything?
Well, I mean, it certainly doesn't hurt, right? And you are distancing yourself from your employer, and you see that on TV even, where people will comment and say, this does not reflect the views of, of my employer. So, I mean, it is helpful. I think it ties back to what effect is it having on the company. Because that disclaimer doesn't really matter if people are finding the employer and complaining or calling or threatening or any kinds of, or other employees, right, who may have seen this and expressed discomfort with it. So I think in that situation, the first thing to do is hopefully have a social media policy, is to, have a discussion with that employee and say, here's our policy. We're not trying to limit your speech. We're not trying to say, what kind of viewpoint you can have in this situation, but here is our concern. And if there are things already happening, address with that employee and say, we appreciate that you've got the disclaimer, but it's easy enough for people to find where you work, and we're getting these complaints, or we're having these concerns. But I think even prophylactically, it's fine to call them in, and again, you don't have to discipline them. But we've seen just recently some social media events where there are explicit actions against employers, and to say to that employee, say, look, we haven't seen anything yet, assuming you haven't, but this is our concern. So we're not telling you can't express your viewpoint, but we are telling you that this is something that if it has an effect on the company, we would have a different stance on it.
So how should HR craft policies addressing political activity without violating employee rights?
Yeah, I think, again, I would want activity that focuses on behavior rather than viewpoint. So, you can discuss, certainly like no threats, no harassment, those are things that I think anybody would agree would be improper, and to, put employees, notice about that. But then also to say, again, any kind of speech that has a, significant or material or whatever non-legal words you want to use in there that sounds not, quite so legalese, that has effect on the company, can be, can be a subject of discussion or discipline. But again, any kind of policy that focuses on the outcomes of the speech and the way that it is expressed rather than the content of the speech itself, you're going to be on safer ground.
Right. Yeah, I like what you said earlier about it. It's a focus on the conduct rather than what's actually being said.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's also, getting back to your other question about HR. Sometimes it's easy to tie it to the workspace because you're getting complaints, right? You've got the emails, you've got the text, you've got, a written, evidence of it. But, if this is happening in the workplace, there's a heated exchange in the workplace for HR to note that, right? Because there may not be, right? It may not be online. It may be like, just people in their cubes having a heated disagreement, and for HR just to note, how that happens. Like, it's one thing to express an opinion at conversational tone. It's another thing to express an opinion where you're red in the face and yelling. And I think those are details that HR should be recording. If there is a need for some kind of discipline, then you've got that. You've got the memo and file about what happened and about the way that opinion was expressed, not the opinion itself, but the way that it was expressed to document that, because those kinds of details can be missed if you don't document them and putting in writing, and they can be really important later on if you do have to have a conversation with that employee.
Sure. Yeah. No, those are really, really good points. So I have another hypothetical situation for you. An employee joins a company that previously had no stated political affiliations. However, a year later, leadership publicly aligns the organization with a political stance and directs HR to ask about political party preferences during job interviews. The employee at the company publicly disagrees with this. How should HR respond to that?
Yeah, wow, that's an unpleasant one. I think, fortunately, most employers don't do that. But in the event that does happen, if they're, again, and employer, HR and audience members, right, got to check out your state law. If you are not yourself a lawyer, that's a situation where I would call inside or outside counsel to loop them in, because it really depends on where you are. There are some states where, that employer's action, could be illegal. Washington, D.C. being one. You can't make, political affiliation is a protected class. And there are other states that have similar laws that make it a protected class. And if somebody, complains because the company has taken the stance, they may be legally protected. So that's one thing that you need to be concerned about. If you are not in one of those states, it's not necessarily illegal for the company to do that. And as distasteful as it may be to, the person who is complaining, to explain that to them, say, hey, we understand how you may have these feelings about this. This is, while you may disagree, this is a legal stance for the company to make, and we want to make sure this is a place where you're going to be happy and we're going to be happy, and that's why we're asking these questions.
Yeah, I guess the organization could justify it as, identifying people who are aligned with their mission,
sure,
clients, right?
Exactly right. Yeah, it's just like another kind of something, yeah, exactly right. It's something that you have on your mission statement, and we want our employees to be aligned. Like, you don't want to work in a place where you're not going to be happy if this is our stated mission. And so, exactly right. We want to make sure that the company's happy and that you will be happy here. There's no point in having you, having a place where you're going to disagree with what we're doing.
We've already touched on this, but I do want to go back to it to kind of drive the point home. So, how can HR investigate politically sensitive situations without bias or legal exposure?
Yeah, I think it is often true with HR investigations. It needs to be even-handed, right? You can't be investigating people who are, expressing a certain viewpoint and not addressing the same kinds of political speech on the other side. So, as often the case, a policy that is well spelled out and that is evenly implemented and that focuses on the behavior rather than the speech, you're going to be on pretty solid ground. So I think HR needs to make sure you're running the same playbook each time. Because another thing, that kind of gets looped into this, while there is no, again, overarching federal law that directly protects private, speech in the private workspace, some of this also can get looped into anti-discrimination laws. Like, if somebody expressing an opinion and it tends to align with a protected category, so it turns out that this is only women expressing this, or only people of color. You name the protected class that's closely aligned with that, then you've got to worry about anti-discrimination laws and retaliation there. But again, if HR has a neutral policy, which is well spelled out, well publicized, and they're conducting investigations or conversations with people on an even-handed basis whenever the behavior occurs, then you're going to be on much more solid ground.
So, one more hypothetical scenario. We have two employees who have a heated political disagreement during a team meeting. One complains to HR that the other has created a hostile work environment. Both of these employees are well regarded with no prior issues. How should an HR professional respond?
Yeah, and again, it gets back to do we have a protected category issue here? And that's where I would start with this. Is this discussion or the topic or the people involved, aligned in some kind of protected category, so that you could, whether it exists in this instance or not, have a hostile work environment in the sense that we mean that under Title VII. So I think HR needs to address that evenly with both people. I think, it never hurts to have the conversation, whether or not the employee is in a protected class, or we arguably have someone who could have a cause of action under Title VII or some other kind of anti-discrimination law. It never hurts to have the conversation with both of them. Again, tying it to behavior and impacts on the workplace rather than the speech itself. I'm sure other people have seen this. They may have had thoughts about this, or maybe have concerns about that, and use it as an opportunity to educate people about, whatever policies the organization has on political speech, both in and outside the workplace.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's one thing to have a civil debate about political stance, right? It's entirely another thing if you have, employees screaming at each other, perhaps more in a threatening tone, things like that. Very, very different kind of conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, you kind of think about it like if you had a husband and wife, team in the workplace, and they get into an argument about whatever, who was supposed to pick up the milk the last time, the things that, people in it, anybody in a marriage knows these kinds of fights, and it happens in the workplace. Like, that's not political speech, but if it's heated, people are listening to this and can get, concerned. We've seen, domestic disputes can often end up being very dangerous. And so again, kind of taking it out of the political context, like, how would you handle that? Same way, right? You would speak to both of them and say, we understand you're in a marriage and you've got the issues that you are dealing with, but this is the impact that it's having on the company, and you can't have a a red-faced kind of argument at the workplace lunch table because people get concerned, understandably.
Sure, regardless of topic.
Right.
So, what type of training can HR provide to help managers handle political discussions or conflicts? Because I think, HR people are generally well equipped at handling conflict, different types of situations like this. But what about managers? That's not something that a manager is necessarily going to handle on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I think that's a great point because you're right. I mean, most people in HR, they're not new to this kind of issue, but your frontline manager may not, and certainly may not see it on a regular basis. I think giving them a clear playbook, to follow. And it's you folks in the audience and HR folks are probably sick of hearing this, but training your frontline folks to be able to spot this, even if it is only this is when you call HR, right? Like if you see this, don't try to diffuse it yourself. This is when you call HR. And to the extent that you're relying on frontline managers to be able to deal with some of these situations, again, just a paint by numbers playbook. Like this is the play we run every time. Make sure that you're doing it every time on an even-handed basis, and you're tying it to workplace behavior. I think would go a long way to, because if you've got a manager that doesn't have experience with this and they've got 10 other things they're worried about, they may jump into this into not trying to cause trouble, but in a way that does create some liability for the company.
Sure. Yeah. So I love the idea of a playbook. Here's a few tips on how to handle a certain situation, and here's what to do when it escalates beyond what we're telling you, and give us a call.
Right. Exactly. Not just like you've done here. Like hypotheticals are great. Here are some of the things managers that might come up in your workspace, and this is how we would deal with them.
And so, are there any emerging trends that HR should anticipate regarding political activity and employment?
Right, we're seeing it, right? The emerging trends, right? We're seeing it. The trend is here. It hit a couple of weeks ago. I think we're seeing a lot more what we call doxing, right? Where outside groups are actively bringing these up with employers, hoping that the employer's going to take action against employees. That's a whole nother topic. What constitutes doxing? There's no federal law on it, but essentially when people are, again, even if people are not posting on LinkedIn, they're posting on their private channels. We'll have sometimes we've seen coordinated efforts where they'll people who disagree with that speech find out where this person works and will contact the employer. And then what do you do in that situation, right? It was just somebody who was expressing their opinion on social media, not necessarily in an inflammatory way, but it has this kind of impact. So I think that is probably the big one is we're seeing the workplace. I think a lot of instances, the employers are not looking to get involved in this, right? They get involved at the last instance, but many employers are getting dragged into this as part of the whole social media landscape. So I think that one is we're gonna just see that more and more on both sides.
Yeah, that's a good point. And when social media back, several years ago, right, when social media became very popular, a lot of organizations created a social media policy at that time, or hopefully they did. But I guess the point is, if they haven't, now would be the time.
Right. Absolutely. And then, of course, AI's the trend for everything, everywhere. But that's a new one. Like people can create deep fakes, they can create videos. Like, so you've got these companies have an added layer of, did this person actually make this statement? Is this person that it looks like our employee in the video? Is it actually this person in the video, or was this AI generated? So I think that's just going to be another one, another wrinkle in this.
Yeah, really, really good point. Thank you. So looking ahead, how do you see political divide shaping workplaces over the next few years? And what can we do as HR professionals now to prepare for it?
Yeah, I mean, I wish it were otherwise. this trend is not going away. If anything, it's probably going to get more acute again with doxing, with AI, with just the heated nature of our politics today and people's right. I mean, it's not just our kids are on social media. We're all on social media on multiple platforms now, and anybody with a phone can shoot a video and post it, within minutes. So I think for HR just to recognize that that's the landscape that we are in, to anticipate that we're going to have more of this going forward. To again, like you said, like take that social media policy that you may have drafted 5 years ago. Take another look at it with an eye to like, okay, here's the new landscape. We may get pulled into this, whether we like it or not. How are we going to handle this? And then having, regular trainings with HR, with managers to, all of your employees so that everybody knows the ground rules going forward.
Yeah, I love the addition of, taking a look at your social media policy and taking new technology into consideration. And I think you bring up a good point, which is just, this is yet another topic that HR needs to stay on top of because it is ever evolving. I mean,
yes.
Even week by week, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, right. Right. Exactly. It's full-time employment for lawyers and HR professionals. That's for sure.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Tom, for sharing your insights with us. That's going to do it for this week's episode of Honest HR, and we will catch you next time.
Hello, friends. We hope this week's episode gave you the candid tips and insights you need to keep growing and thriving in your career. Honest HR is part of HR Daily, the content series from SHRM that delivers a daily newsletter directly to your inbox, filled with all the latest HR news and research. Sign up at shrm.org/HRdaily. Plus, follow SHRM on social media for even more clips and stories. Like, share, and add to the comments. Because real change starts with real talk.
SHRM. This podcast is approved for 0.5 professional development credits, aka PDCs, toward SHRM-CP and SHRM-SCP recertification. Enter the following PDC activity ID in your SHRM activity portal to log your credit. 25-Z3NXH. That's 25-Z3NXH. This ID expires on November 1st, 2026.